Okay, so moving on to part two, as promised, we're going to take what we just learned and apply it to this, very professional article on Agatha Christie. And here I've got the image that's at the top of the article. So a couple quick things. This is not what we would call an academic article, which are the type of articles you often have to cite in college classes. It's online, it's very professional, it's academic, and it cites its sources, is non-biased, does a really good job of supporting its argument, but it wouldn't be academic in the traditional sense. So that's why I've called it a professional article. And in this class, you can use both professional and academic articles. They don't all have to be academic. We'll talk about the nuances and differences between those after the midterm point in the class. But one of the key things identifying that this is not an academic article is it's online. And I've taken the image in the caption here to just kind of identify it for the image on the slide. But it's very professional because, like I said, it supports its sources, it uses logic, it's non-biased, etc. So it still would work in my class as a source for one of your papers. But the reason I used this image was to kind of show you that this would not look like an academic article, but it does look like a professional article. But also because under the quote you have a caption, which says, Agatha Christie's legendary detective, Hercule Poirot, is an example of a character responding defiantly and positively to the pressures of literary modernism. So what does that sound like to you? Does that sound like a thesis? Could be. And so in terms of inspectional reading, which again is figuring out the meaning of the text without really reading it the whole way through, with a web article, you might have things like images and captions, and those might tell you a lot. This one might even have a thesis statement right there. So just kind of a helpful clue, because in the 21st century, inspectional reading should not involve just books or articles, but all kinds of things. Ads, TV shows, web articles like this one. All right, let's do some of the inspectional reading. So remember, step one for an article was think carefully about the title and look up any words you don't know that are in the title. So the title of this article is Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot, and Reverse Modernism. Those first two are pretty straightforward. We know it's going to be about those two things because I researched looking for articles that dealt with those two things. So reverse modernism is really going to be the key here. And modernism is a word we might not know. So that's a word we should look up per the instructions. And here's a definition I found from Encyclopedia Britannica. In the fine arts, a break with the past and the concurrent search for new forms of expression. Modernism fostered a period of experimentation in the arts from the late 19th to the mid-20th century, particularly in the years following World War I. So it says in the fine arts. So looking back at that caption on the previous slide, you will notice it said literary modernism in that caption, even though the title just has reverse modernism. So I knew there might be more than one meaning of modernism, so I wanted to find a meaning of modernism that dealt specifically with literature. And so that's why I used this definition compared to some of the other ones I found when I Googled it, because it talked about modernism in the fine arts. So that connection between fine arts and literature means I might be on the right track to finding a right definition for modernism. And so there's a few things we can take away from this. It denotes a break with the past. It features new forms of expression. Experimental writing would be part of that. It was mainly in the late 19th to the early and mid-20th century, especially after World War I. So maybe World War I was particularly influential on it. So I already have some notes I could jot down. Now, I researched this definition, and that's a good thing to do, but sometimes the article itself will actually define its terms. If it's a good article, it will. Some articles are written for such a specific audience, they just arrogantly assume their audience already knows their terms. But a good author will always define their terms. And so when you use specialized language in your writing for this class, you should also define your terms. In this article, because it's a web article, it's written for a little bit wider audience. That's one of the things that's good about it. This author, Eric Martin, does a very good job at defining his terms. So if we read just the first few paragraphs, not the whole article, remember we're doing inspectional reading, but if we read just the first few paragraphs, we'll see how he actually defines modernism. And so here's his definition of modernism from the article. Where the writers who would be later canonized as modernists expressed a profound sense of anxiety and seemed always to think of the world as breaking apart. So, how does this definition match up with the one we found? Well, pretty closely. It fills in some gaps. In addition to giving us the time period, which we already had, it gives us some of the most famous writers from that period. And then it gives us a couple of ideas: anxiety and the world breaking apart. So, as we see a break with the past and a search for a new form of expression, we see kind of a connection here, but also an extension, not just a connection, a filling in of the gaps. Perhaps one of the reasons why these writers wanted to break with the past was that they were anxious about a newer modern world that they saw as a world breaking apart. So now we've got a pretty well-rounded definition of modernism. So what is this article about? If we know what modernism means, but we want to interpret the article based solely on the title, nothing else, because we're doing inspectional reading, what do you think it means that it's about reverse modernism? The title of the article implies that Hercule Poirot provides some kind of contrast or opposition to this modern view of the world, right? So another thing you can do is you can look up synonyms for words. So what does reverse mean? Going in the opposite direction. So if the modernist writers see the world as breaking apart and they have anxiety over that, if Hercule Poirot or Agatha Christie through Hercule Poirot provides reverse modernism, goes in the other direction, then Christie and Poirot, in contrast to these authors and characters, are showing the world perhaps as ordered rather than breaking apart, and perhaps have like a calming effect on the reader rather than dealing with the anxiety or dealing with it in a different way. So we can infer from this that the author's arguing that Agatha Christie takes Hercule Poirot and sends her work in a different direction from the writers who are most famous at this time. We can draw that conclusion from the title. And that's really what the thesis of the piece is, as you'll see on the next slide. Now, there's a couple of important things here that kind of helped me reach this conclusion I want to take note of. Remember, the author, Martin, his definition of literary modernism talked about the canon, said that writers like James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, William Faulkner, and Virginia Woolf were part of the canon of modernism. There's an implication there that Agatha Christie was not. So what does that word canon mean? I don't think we're talking about shooting explosive balls out of a barrel. No, it's according to what I found online, researching it from a newspaper that seemed reliable, the Daily Nebraskan. Canon is a body of books, narrative, and other texts considered to be the most important and influential of a particular time period. So when someone thinks of modernism, they think of James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, William Faulkner, and Virginia Woolf. And so that helps us further round out our definition of modernism. And it shows us that the author is doing something important here with Agatha Christie and Hercule Poirot. Maybe Agatha Christie is not part of the canon of modernism, but the definition here uses passive voice. It says, other texts considered to be the most important. Well, who's considering this? Who has determined these texts are the most important? Whoever it is, maybe we can infer that this author, Martin, is making the argument that Agatha Christie should be part of that canon, or that how we've defined that canon determined it is problematic. So just from reading the title of the article and enough of the first few paragraphs to be able to define the word modernism, we've already got quite a bit of what the article is about by only reading barely any of it and by doing inspectional reading. And so the other bullet point here I skipped over is just kind of my pulling together of the notes I made from defining modernism, both from the dictionary online and from the article. So it has a break with the past, experimentation, fractured world, sense of anxiety. And if Hercule Poirot is going in the reverse direction, then reverse modernism is the opposite of those four things I collected in my notes. So we can learn all of this about the text just from doing an inspectional reading of the title. And I already mentioned that the implications here, since Martin mentions these famous writers, is that maybe Agatha Christie should be part of the canon, or maybe it's good that she's not. But if she's not, and she's an important writer, maybe we need to redefine what the criteria are for being in the canon. So this is a really important question alluded to by the definition of modernism our author gives, and it's a question we can pursue further as we go deeper into the article. All right, so the next step after analyzing the title is to read just the first few paragraphs or pages, however long it takes to get to the end of the first subsection and to get to the author's thesis. So what is the thesis? He says, where the writers who would be later canonized as modernists expressed a profound sense of anxiety and seemed to always think of the world as breaking apart, Agatha Christie's staple detective hero reassuringly manages to put things back together. So if these writers see the world as fractured, what Hercule Poirot does is put things back together. So just like we assumed, he is going in the reverse direction of modernism. That is indeed what this author argues. So the actual thesis matches up perfectly with our assumption made by analyzing the title. So you could say we didn't even really need to read the first few paragraphs. Well, why did we do it? Well, the title might not always be as informative as the title of this article is. So it's good, like you don't need to read the whole article, obviously, but read enough to know the thesis. And here we can see that the thesis matches up to the title. And there's another clue. Because this is a web article, we also get a thesis in that caption under the picture. Agatha Christie's legendary detective is an example of a character responding defiantly and positively to the pressures of literary modernism. I think that's almost a better thesis than the one at the end of the intro or the end of the first section. But there's several ways by reading barely any of this article we can understand really clearly what the meaning of it is. Now, it's good to go through and see how the author supports this argument and maybe see some implications for further study, especially if this is a topic we're writing a paper on or researching with. But if someone just asked you, hey, what is this article about? You could tell them after only having read the title, the caption, and the first few paragraphs. That's why inspectional reading is so important. All right, the next step is the title of each subsection. So I'm going to list those out now, and we'll see what each one means. So Christie's holistic hero, Hercule Poirot. So this tells me the author is going to give me background on Poirot, and that adjective holistic is really important. This means that because the modernists, the canonical modernists, were talking about the world breaking apart, and this author's thesis is that Poirot restores order, that he's holistic, he's not breaking apart, is really important. So what we'll probably get here, just by reading the title of this section without actually reading it in its entirety, we can infer that it'll give us more background on Poirot, and that background will show how he fits with the overall thesis of the paper. The next subsection is called There's Modernism, and then there's Modernism. So more background and context. There's a few pieces going here, right? There's Agatha Christie, there's Hercule Poirot, and there's modernism. Those are like the three pieces of this article. So in the first subsection, you have background on Poirot. In the second subsection, you have background on modernism. That only makes sense. But this specific subsection tells us a little bit more, just like holistic tells us a little bit more about Poirot. It shows that modernism is not just a literary movement, but it's a complex, nuanced, nebulous movement. It's difficult to understand with all these things going on. And so subsection titles can tell us a lot. The next is of manners and mysteries. This one is not as obvious. I had to read a little bit to figure this one out. But very quickly, I realized it's giving us, again, some background on a genre called the novel of manners. Part of the way this author argues that Hercule Poirot counters or reverses modernism is by fitting in a genre of writing called the novel of manners. And so it's important for this author to then give background on what the novel of manners is. But again, that might not be super obvious from that title unless you're really familiar with literary studies. So sometimes you do have to read a little bit more to get what the section is about. 3 more subsections. Next up is Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. Now, I know from reading the first few paragraphs that the main piece of evidence this author is going to use is Agatha Christie's novel, The Murder on the Orient Express. Analyzing this novel is how the author is going to prove his argument. He's said that in the intro, which I did read. So even though this section is literally just the title of a book, and even though I'm not reading this section right now, because I've read the intro, I know this is the part of the paper where the author moves from background and context to analysis. The next section is called Reverse Modernism. So now I can kind of see the shape of the paper coming together. Now that he's done some analysis to prove his argument, he's going to drive that argument home because you have the title, the most important part of the title of the paper, as the title of this subsection. So we're moving from kind of the immediate focus on the object of analysis to the conclusions the author draws from that analysis. And finally, the last section is called Two Modernisms. So what could this imply? Without even having read this, I can infer that it could imply a lot of things. Perhaps that there were 2 strains of modernism, not just a reverse modernism, but a modernism unique to Hercule Poirot that Christie's offering is like a counter to the main modernism we know. And so this is the last section. So what might the author be doing here? Showing why the argument is important, how it has value, which answers the final question from the questions Adler says we should ask of a book when we read it. So this could end up being a really important article, potentially. So with these 6 subsections, just from reading their titles, identifying what they're about, now we can look at how the author has structured his argument. There's an intro with a very brief background and a clear thesis. A few sections that provide background. You need to know some things to understand the argument. The author helps you know those things more. Then the analysis of an example to prove the argument. And in this case, the author is focusing on a novel. So that's what we call a case study or a cultural artifact. Later in this class, you'll have to write a paper where you pick a cultural artifact yourself, a novel, a movie, something similar, and analyze it to prove an argument of yours. And so this is an example of doing that. And in many ways, this article is a good example of the type of writing you'll be doing in this class. So we go from intro with thesis, background, an example. Section 5 is an illustration of how that example supports the argument. Remember, the 5th section had the title of the article there, and it came right after the analysis. So good writers, when they prove their arguments, they connect their analysis, their evidence, to their main point. And so that clearly is what happens in Section 5. In Section 6, we finish out by an explanation of why the argument is important and relevant. So intro with thesis, background info, analysis, connection between analysis and thesis, explanation of why the argument is important. That's the conclusion. So we see how the author has structured his argument, and it's pretty compelling. This seems like a very logical structure. In fact, I would go so far as to say this is the kind of structure you should probably use on your papers in this class. A few more things. Remember, we said you should also read the first paragraph or few paragraphs of each subsection, though you don't need to read the article in its entirety. And if you do that here, you'll see that each paragraph matches up. You read just a paragraph or 2 into it. Each subsection, the title clearly tells us what's it's about. There's a clear connection there. Just like the thesis matched up to the title. That's because this is a very well-written, well-thought-out argument where the author was very cognizant of his audience. Remember, you always want to be so aware of your audience and engaging them when you write. So, for instance, this article is easy to follow because this writer did that. You'll probably read articles at some point in college where you're frustrated because it's not so clearly laid out. So that's why it's important to read not just the title of each subsection, but also the first few paragraphs of each subsection, even if you're not reading the thing in its entirety. Here, I'm not going to go over all of these because, like I said, they match up so closely that wouldn't be a good use of your time right now. But as you read, when you're actually reading, you want to highlight or note any key terms. That's step 5. And so even if the content of the subsection matches up well with the title of the subsection, you still might want to read a little bit just to see some of these key terms because they'll be helpful to understanding the overall argument. So what are some of the key terms from this article? Novel of manners. Remember, I talked about that subsection. That was the most confusing title of a subsection. So that's a good example of a subsection where you might want to read a little bit more. And once he defines a novel of manners, it becomes much clearer. So a novel of manners was a genre of novels earlier than Hugh Poirot in the 19th rather than the 20th century, but that presented society as very moral and stable. And so you can immediately see the connection there, since the modernist writers don't present the world that way, but Agatha Christie does. There's also the term divided psyche, which comes from Sigmund Freud, and Sigmund Freud was very influential on those canonical modern writers like Faulkner and Woolf. So, and the key word there being divided, right? Because the modernists saw the world as fractured, whereas Christie saw it as whole. And so the author's showing, this influence on modernism, how it came to develop the way it did. Finally, golden era of detective fiction. This is the period. Detective fiction was incredibly popular in the 1920s through the 1950s, and people refer to that age as the golden era of detective fiction. But this is important too, because the author is arguing that the golden era of detective fiction is very similar to the novel of manners, and the very first detective stories by Edgar Allan Poe, the man who basically invented the modern detective, those stories were part of the novel of manners of genres a century earlier. So it only makes sense, this connection between golden detective fiction and novel of manners. And those both contrast, reverse the divided psyche of modernism. So with a few key terms here, we can see some of the ways the author supports his argument. So that's why it's good to define key terms. We understood the argument, now we understand it even better. Somehow I accidentally duplicated this slide. I apologize. Finally, the final step was to look at the bibliography because it might be useful to you later on. This article, being a web article, doesn't have a traditional bibliography, but the author does a good job of citing his sources, which is the true purpose of a bibliography. So I just noted them down here. Some of them are books. The ones in italics are books. Some of them are articles. But I could just punch any of these into Google, find them, and if I'm doing research on Agatha Christie, which I am to teach this class, this bibliography is incredibly helpful to me. So I could steal it, use it, steal it in the sense of it could help me make some of my research easier, because these are now 5 things I can check really quickly. And if they apply to my research, I can use them. Who knows? You may be reading them in this class in a few weeks, and that might be one of the ways this article was helpful to me. So this is not an essential step of inspectional reading, but it can be a helpful one if what you're reading has to do with a larger project you're working on. That might not be the case. It depends on the situation, but it can be very helpful in some situations, so I wanted to make note of it. Finally, I want to finish out this part of the lecture, kind of tie it all together by looking at those questions Adler posed in Chapter 5 of How to Read a Book that he says are the essential questions to ask if you're a demanding reader. So we've done an inspectional reading of this piece, and in about 25 minutes, without even reading the piece as a whole, we're able to see what it's about, how it makes its argument, how it supports it. So now we can move from being inspectional readers to being even more demanding readers and try to answer a couple of these oh so important questions. Remember, the first one is the book or article true? So another way to state this is, do you think Martin, the author here, effectively presents enough compelling evidence to prove his point? Why or why not? I would argue that he did, but you may disagree. And this is a type of question that will be on the discussion board. So I will look forward to hearing what you think. Another one is, what of it? So what do we learn from this? Why might this analysis of Hercule Poirot in relation to modernism be relevant or helpful today? Do any of the issues, for example, alienation, isolation, a fractured world, which concern the modernist writers, still persist today? So these writers have described the modern world as they saw it in the early 20th century, right after World War I, in a certain way. Do you see any similarities to today? And if so, what kind of writing best deals with those issues? Again, this is a question you'll be able to essentially answer on the discussion board in a little bit, but I would just kind of throw out there right now that I see a lot of this type of thing: alienation, isolation, division, disunity, and the global pandemic we're living in right now. So I think it's very applicable today. But the second question that emerges from that is who is right? Because there's kind of two perspectives. There's the perspective of the writers who scholars have canonized that just kind of furthers this belief, but kind of shows how people struggle through it. And then there's Agatha Christie, who's saying there's still potential for order and unity in the world. We don't have to live with disunity and fracture forever. And she does that through a detective who, with his mind, imposes order on chaos. And so which type of writer do you think is the better one for this kind of a world? And that's the kind of question you ask when you become a demanding reader. But our inspectional reading of the article makes that question possible. So what we're going to do now is take some of the things we learned from our inspectional reading of this article and apply them to a Hercule Poirot short story to expand on what we learned last time by analyzing Poirot, and to come back to this question after we've explored some of the things that lead us to the question in a specific story that we've read.